David Miliband, great to see you. What's it like to be back in the UK? Does it feel like you're a stranger in your own land?
It's always nice to be back in the UK. The taxi drivers tell me how to fix the Labour Party, and the interviewers listen to the answers and have follow-up questions, which is different from the US. But obviously I care about Britain, and it's nice to be able to come to the UK with something to say about the work I'm doing at the moment and some of the global challenges that we face.
Do you have a sense of how far things have shifted? I'm just going to do that again, I'll just go to the door. Yeah. Do you have a sense, though, of how far things have shifted in Britain since you left? I mean, do you have a recognition that you come back to a place that politically is altered vastly from when you left it?
Britain's obviously undergoing enormous change. It's made a momentous decision to leave the European Union. Politics has been turned upside down in some ways, but in other ways the two main parties have got a bigger share of the vote than at any time in my lifetime. And obviously I can't be in touch with the ins and outs of change in Britain, but what I do know is that all industrialised societies like the UK are facing the challenge of reinventing themselves, because the wider world is changing fast and we've got to decide what kind of position we want to have in it, a position economically but also socially and politically.
And you see that very much now through the prism of your work with refugees. I mean, this was really a story which dominated the agenda just a couple of years ago, but frankly rarely gets onto it now. Have we gone past the moment when the public are truly engaged with it, do you think?
I'm running a large humanitarian agency working in 30 war-torn countries with 25,000 staff, but the greatest challenge we face is not that we don't know how to solve the problems on the ground, it's that there's a sense of fatalism in the Western world about whether or not the problems are soluble. And I've written my book to try and argue that the refugee crisis, the displacement of record numbers of people because of war, is manageable, not insoluble, and that we all have a responsibility to play our part in doing that, not just governments, but also businesses and individuals.
We'll talk about some of the practicalities that you propose in a moment, but this is very much rooted in your own family story, which you touch on quite deeply actually in the book, that your family were the beneficiaries of those who welcomed refugees.
I think it's important to look back at one's own history, and when I came to write the book I realised the first sentence had to be the first refugees I ever met were my parents, because my dad was a refugee from Belgium in 1940 to the UK, my mum came here in 1946 from Poland, and in the case of my mum, directly her, in the case of my dad, members of their family, they only survived because of strangers who helped them, who didn't care about race or religion, but wanted to help them out of human kindness. And that moral imperative, I think, is strong today in very, very different circumstances. We don't just need people to have a big heart, we need them to know that they're part of a bigger solution that's being offered by governments as well as individuals.
But some of the solutions that you offer in your book, there are practical solutions, there are political solutions. I would imagine that for the vast majority of the public, they look at it and say, it's simply not soluble. Not only is it not solvable, but it has fundamentally changed our politics, particularly in the West and particularly in Europe, and not necessarily for the better.
I think the remarkable thing is that the generosity of the British public remains strong. There's just been a Disaster Emergency Committee appeal for the Rohingya expelled from Burma. £40 million is raised in the space of 10 days. So that beating heart of humanity, I think, is still strong. What people...
Look at the numbers. I mean, it just feels, doesn't it, that whatever the generosity of the British public towards it, this is a situation whether you're looking at Iraq, Syria, whether you're looking at Myanmar, it's almost insurmountable.
Well, my message is that we don't just need to pedal the old humanitarian bicycle faster, we've got to change the way the humanitarian sector works. We've got to think about getting refugees into jobs in the countries that they're in, countries like Uganda, countries like Jordan, countries like Lebanon. We've got to make sure that their kids get education, because that's not a luxury if you're displaced from your country for 10 years. Education becomes a lifeline for you. We've got to change the humanitarian sector, which I think will give confidence to the public that their money is being added to the efforts of government that's being well spent through NGOs and through the United Nations.
You voted for the war in Iraq, and you touch on that in the book. It lies at the heart of one of the issues about the crisis in refugees, doesn't it? Your government, in part, caused what you are now trying to help and correct.
Well, I think that...
What acknowledgement will you give?
I give a very strong acknowledgement about the mistake of the war in Iraq, above all the mistake in the post-war rebuilding of that country, and I'm very, very clear about that. Every time I go to Iraq, I obviously think about the decisions that were made. It's not right to say that every problem in Iraq today goes back to 2003, but no problem can be understood without understanding the consequences of that war, and I think one's got to be very open about that.
But just to take a line from your book, you say, when I visit Iraq, you've acknowledged it too here, and discuss its condition, I think about its history, there is only regret. Is there guilt too when you see what the consequences have been with the refugees that you're now trying?
Well, I think I chose the word regret because I think that the attempt to criminalise the decision in 2003, to say that it was founded on lies or false messages or false documents is not right. I think that the decision that was made by myself and others, I was in the government at the time, were made in good faith, and I think the attempts to turn this into a question of lies doesn't.
But you misunderstand me. I'm not necessarily talking about the legalities of the original decision. I'm talking about their consequences. I mean, we could look at Syria too. The votes that were lost here acting against Assad, the fact that Obama would not enforce his red lines, the consequences of Iraq for the world's politics, and particularly for the refugees who you are now trying to help, were absolutely stymied by what happened in Iraq.
I mean, the tragic thing is that throughout history, refugees have not counted and they didn't count. And after the Second World War, they were given rights, but that lesson has to be relearnt in every generation. If in the 90s, we'd have said Rwandan refugees were not being properly recognised. In the 2000s, Syrian refugees are not being properly recognised. And I think it's really important to take on the point that, yes, we have to work in politics upstream for peace building and peacemaking, but that is the absence of diplomacy is no excuse for a failure on the humanitarian front that can become a source of political instability itself.
But I suppose it's quite a personal question. Do you have a sense of atonement in the work that you're doing now to help the refugees because of how you were involved in sowing some of the seeds that have led us to some of these?
I have a very...
Do you have a sense of atonement?
I have a sense of contribution, and that's what I am trying to do. I think that you can see all sorts of complex factors that go into the refugee crisis, but one's also got to reflect on one's own personal responsibilities. But what motivates me is actually a sense that I can make a difference. And to have 25,000 staff who are delivering health and education and protection for women and kids in the most desperate circumstances makes me feel I'm making a contribution according to the values that drive me forward.
And in terms of how it's affected world politics, Angela Merkel, of course, who you knew very well when you were Foreign Secretary, you say in your book that Germany's response to the refugee crisis was bold, brave, and I would argue successful. Look what happened in the consequences of the German elections that we've just witnessed. Yes, she is still in place, but the impact on her position politically because of the decisions that she made on refugees, the rise of the far right in Germany, that cannot be a moment of success.
Well, remember, the origins of the far right rise in Germany are to do with the euro rather than to do with the refugee crisis.
We know exactly what was argued during the German election. They moved very far about the consequences of the euro, very far from that.
I was going to say, it's important not to forget that there was the original revolt of the far right was around the euro. They then capitalised on the refugee crisis in exactly the way that you say. But Mrs. Merkel took a position that I would argue was principled. She's also taken a position that was practical, in that if you go to any town or city in Germany, you see the effort at integration, because successful integration of those refugees who are allowed to stay is very important. But I think there's something else that we mustn't forget. There are risks of action, but there are also risks of inaction. And when Mrs. Merkel made her decision, there were already 450,000 refugees in Germany. And so the question was, would she continue to ignore the issue, or would she get to grips with it? And my feeling about Europe's response, including the UK, has been that we've been too late to the refugee game. We've been focused on the euro crisis, focused on the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2013, 2014. The Pope went to Lampedusa in 2014 and accused us all of the globalization of indifference. And now we're playing catch up. And what Mrs. Merkel has tried to do is get ahead of the game, and I think she deserves credit for it.
So do you think that David Cameron and after that Theresa May should have acted in the same way as Angela Merkel?
Yes, in the
same degree of welcoming the numbers into the...
Well, it's different, of course, because of the geography being so different. But my message about the UK is we're doing half of the equation in a world-leading way. British development aid, I've seen it for myself every week. I'm travelling around the world last week in Jordan. British development aid is top quality, delivered at scale, really making a difference. But the idea that we can then not welcome refugees to our own community, I think is a big mistake. I know from my own constituency, at the moment, 6 refugees per parliamentary constituency are allowed into the UK every year. No one is going to persuade me that South Shields is going to be overwhelmed by having 6 refugees every year. So if the question is, could Britain, through David Cameron and then Theresa May, be doing more to welcome refugees here as well as have effective overseas aid? The answer would be yes.
What about the way global politics is arguing against this position, and we know how difficult it is, frankly, to sell it, to welcome more people here at the moment. You have a president in whose country you are working, who is working in arguably the opposite direction to yours.
Not arguably.
Well, not arguably. You have a president who is working in the opposite direction to the way you wish the world to go. How do you counter the force of President Trump on that?
I think we've got to make 2 arguments. First of all, that these refugees have stories that would not just make your heart melt, but make you recognise that they will know the value of freedom. If you're running from Damascus where your bakery has been bombed, you're going to know the value of freedom in a Western country. But the second argument we've got to make is this isn't just about a big heart. It's also about having a clear head, that we live in a connected world. And the idea that walls should come to define the first half of the 21st century, when the first half of my life was all about breaking down walls in Europe, breaking down the Iron Curtain between East and West, seems to me to be a grave folly, a dangerous folly, because the truth is, problems in the Middle East or problems in Africa, if they're not dealt with, will end up affecting us too.
Let's move on to Labour. Do you feel as if you still belong in the Labour Party?
Yes, I've been a member of the Labour Party for 30 years, and I'll always be a member of the Labour Party. Obviously, the Labour Party is being led from a position that wasn't the majority position when I was active in British politics, but I'm always a member of the Labour Party.
But you were utterly scathing just over 12 months ago about Jeremy Corbyn being leader of it. September 2016, you said Labour had never been further from power since the 1930s. You've been proved completely wrong on that, haven't you, by Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, I welcome Labour's overperformance, if you like, beyond expectations in the general election. But I also know that we're still in opposition. We're still a long way from power. We're still 65 seats below the Conservative level. And so there can be...
Look how tight the polls are. I mean, it is a completely realistic prospect, given what we're seeing in politics at the moment, that Jeremy Corbyn could be the next Prime Minister.
And the fact that Labour is in a better position than I expected, I welcome. I don't have any hesitation in saying that. But I also know that the last 100 yards to power are the most difficult 100 yards. And it's very, very important that we recognise, all of us, that the problems that countries like this face are real, that the need for rejuvenation, revitalisation in progressive politics is also real, and that there's work to be done. So I'm never going to celebrate a second place in politics because there are no silver medals in politics.
But they're in a completely different place to the one that you expected them to be. I mean, in the same speech last year, you said nationalisation can't be the answer to everything, anti-austerity speeches can't explain everything, corporation taxes can't pay for everything. It doesn't add up. People aren't stupid. A lot of people voted for what Jeremy Corbyn, and a lot of very young people too, who were disengaged before.
Which I welcome, and one should have no hesitation in saying that. But equally, one's got to be concerned to go from second place to first place. And you're right that politics is in a tumultuous state. The issues that we face in respect of Brexit goes beyond party politics. It's a defining decision for the country, and it's going to be absolutely critical, especially for those young people who you refer to. And so I know that politics is in flux, but I also know that for Labour to really be the kind of influence that it needs to be on national life, it needs to be in government, not in opposition.
And what more does Jeremy Corbyn need to do to argue for the case, for the deal that you would seek on Brexit?
Well, I think that in respect of Brexit, new facts are coming clear certainly every week and practically every day. The story today about developing our own customs system, we're going to have to hire loads more customs officers. The story that was told, the menu that was presented at the referendum of what Brexit would mean, the dish that's arrived at the table is a very different dish, whether in respect of the amount of bureaucracy that's going to be involved, the cost that's going to be involved, the position of Northern Ireland, which is a very serious one. And my view is very simple, that Parliament and the people should be able to have a say on the final deal. It seems like the government are acceding to some of that.
So a second referendum then will be your...
Well, I would say it would be a first referendum on life in Europe and life outside Europe, because we've never actually had, until the deal is done, the kind of explanation of what Brexit means.
So you just don't want to listen to the British public who've already made their case clear on this?
No, I want the British public to have a democracy that doesn't die on the 23rd of June 2016, because it's the role of Parliament to scrutinise, to engage, to protect the public from a range of different dangers and threats. And I think that the public expect there to be real engagement with the issues that are presented, economic, political and social.
Do you acknowledge that Labour laid part of the groundwork for the Brexit vote by actively pursuing a relaxed policy on immigration?
Well, undoubtedly there was a mistake not to have the transitional arrangements from 2004. Just to remind you of the history, 8 European countries were brought into the European Union. It was a huge thing to achieve because it stabilised Central and Eastern Europe. The decision not to have transitional arrangements for the movement of labour was undoubtedly a mistake, and it undoubtedly fuelled the kind of animus or concern or rejection of the European Union.
There are some that would argue that's exactly where the seeds were sown of where Labour lost touch with some of its grassroots, some of its key communities that had been Labour through and through. It was through that policy that not only brought out the consequences of Brexit, but led to the demise of the party that you
Well, I think that if that was the case, then we probably wouldn't have won the election in 2005. So one's got to be careful in rewriting their history without in any way ducking the consequences of that decision. And it comes back to what I was saying about the refugee crisis. People, it's not a matter of being xenophobic or not, it's a matter of wanting the system to be properly managed and properly run. And I think there's no doubt that to have managed a transitional plan after 2008 for those 8 countries in Eastern Europe would have been a more effective way of running the policy and would have been better politics. The tragedy is that Britain was more influential in Europe at the end of our 13 years in government than ever before, but Europe was less popular in Britain than it had been for a very long time.
Because of the way that you'd managed it. In your own seat, South Shields, voted resolutely for Brexit, 62% in favour of Brexit. What sort of legacy is that for you as an MP?
Well, I was back in South Shields in September, and the warmth of the people is real, but their passion about politics and about Europe is not to be denied.
It's extraordinary from your politics and what they voted for in Brexit, where you really lost the argument with them.
Well, I think that the figures speak for themselves, so there's absolutely no point in countermanding or trying to deny the reality. One has to take that on the chin. Equally, I would argue that the tragedy is it's places like South Shields that are going to suffer the most as a result of Brexit. South Tyneside Council, I happened to read in the paper today, is now saying, look, we need extra help in the course of Brexit because of what it's going to do to communities in the northeast of England. And certainly the message I got in South Shields when I was there in September was people, I'm not going to pretend to you, everyone was suddenly saying, we got it all wrong. But people were saying, hang on, I didn't know about this influence on jobs. I didn't know about this impact on European aid. And so that's why I say we can't fall for the argument that once we've voted on the 23rd of June, everyone's got to shut up and democracy finishes. That would be a ridiculous position to be in.
And another sort of more personal question about it. There are some that will look at you since your departure from the British political stage and say, actually, if you forgive me, you became the sort of poster boy for an elite that people were rejecting, people who hadn't worked outside politics, who'd trodden that path through the courses at Oxford and come straight to politics. There was absolutely the character that you represented within British politics that vast numbers are now.
Well, it's lovely to be back. look, one's got to think hard
You're
about.
part of that bubble that was rejected, where people felt disconnected from politics.
It didn't feel like I was in the bubble when I was in the Temple Park Leisure Centre in South Shields in the swimming pool with my kids, and people come up to me and saying, you know, when are you going to sort out my housing? When are you going to do this about my job? What about my child support agency? And one of the great things about British democracy is that you continue to represent a seat when you are a minister in office. But of course you're right to say that if you end up, that Westminster can become its own bubble, and you've got to fight against it. I don't think that the essence of people's vote on Brexit, to take that as an example, I don't think it was about vengeance. I don't think we should put that in people's mind. I think people
are angry, weren't they? It was the one opportunity they could kick against the system.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is I think we've got to give proper respect to the reasons that people voted for. They were persuaded that it would be better, I think, for their own interests as well as for the national interest. I happen to disagree with that, and I do think that facts have come to light since the referendum that have given people pause. Because the truth is that 510 days after the referendum, we're nowhere near clear about what Brexit is going to mean, other than a real threat, not just to jobs and living standards, but also to Britain's political influence around the world.
Just a couple more questions on Labour, and I must ask you about Robert Mugabe too. The levels of anti-Semitism, the accusations of anti-Semitism that have been levelled at Labour and continue to be levelled at the Labour Party, what do you make of that? How can it be that happens in your party?
I never thought I would see the day when you'd have the words Labour and anti-Semitism in the same sentence, never mind in the same headline. And my position on this is really clear, that you should never get into the position where you're saying, oh, this is overblown, this isn't really... You've got to take allegations very, very seriously. You've got to proactively build a culture that fights against that kind of discrimination, that odious discrimination.
Do you think that culture is being built now?
I can't, for me, that really would be to fall into the trap of sitting in the global elite 3,000 miles away and start talking about what a culture is here. What I know is that there are...
Connected to the past again.
Yeah, but there are...
feel personally very strongly in that.
Of course I do, and the people I talk to also feel incredibly strongly. The beating heart of progressive politics is still very strong, and people reject discrimination, anti-Semitism, odious forms of racism, all forms of racism, with a real passion. But the fact that there are these flare-ups show that it's really important to be vigilant. And my position would be, you're never doing enough. There's always more to be done.
So Jeremy Corbyn needs to
look, there's always more to be done, because we can't allow our country to end up condoning or allowing a renewal of these forms of racism that have been stamped on effectively.
We're not necessarily talking about the country, we're talking about a very particular part of our political spectrum, aren't we?
Well, I think that certainly, I mean, you're totally legitimate for you to ask about Labour, and I'm very happy to answer about Labour, but the truth is it affects the country as a whole, and the real voice and the real heart of British people, I think, is to reject that kind of discrimination and to want to see their leaders very strongly rejecting it too.
Would you come back to lead a centrist party?
I don't see any circumstances at the moment, well actually I don't see any circumstances at all, where new parties are on the horizon, because we've got a situation where the two main parties actually got a higher share of the vote than any election, I think, since 1955. And so it's strange. You probably wouldn't have predicted this a year or two ago. You'd have thought politics around the world is fragmenting. You had in Britain UKIP, you've got the SNP growing. It looked like there was a more opening. What's happened is that there's been a renewal, actually, of affiliation to the two main parties. And I feel I feel it's still, the Labour Party that I joined is still the party that embodies the values that I hold dear. And
would you be tempted back into politics here? And would you rule out working for a different party if it formed a centrepiece?
Yeah, no, I'm not working for other parties. I don't want to give any there's nothing in all that. I mean, I'm not talking to people about it. It'd be completely wrong to give any sense of that, because I'm not. I want to see the Labour Party as a governing party embodying progressive, radical, new thinking to address those major crises, yes, of inequality, yes, of international relations, yes, of community relations, that historically Labour has been absolutely key to addressing. I want to see it in government.
Just before we move on to the end, just a comment from you, if you would, on what is happening in Zimbabwe at the moment. You were active when you were Foreign Secretary in getting his knighthood annulled. You were deeply involved in the moves against him when Labour was in power. What's your impression and take on what's happening there?
So my perspective on Zimbabwe is shaped by one thing above all others. I've got staff members on the ground in Harare and elsewhere, and what they're telling me today is that the situation is relatively calm. They're telling me today that our programs continue to be delivered, and my goodness, the people of Zimbabwe need more of those programs. And they're telling me too that there's a real concern among the people of Zimbabwe that they get real progress, and they are praying, frankly, that they get the chance to fulfill their ambitions for themselves and for the country.
But to see him in the position that he is now, after all the pressure that you put on the international community around Robert Mugabe, it seems, after all these years, to be having some result.
Well, I think that we don't honestly know what's going on, or I don't honestly know the internal situation at the moment. The ZANU-PF party split. Split many times, but most recently with the vice president out of the country. And I think one's got to be very careful to just hope for the best, plan that it might not be the best, but remember that Zimbabwe, 40 years ago, Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. And it's a country whose people deserve a decent chance, better than they've had.
One of the very moving stories in your book is the visit that you paid recently after an extraordinary discovery about your grandfather back to Germany. It was discovered that his last resting place, tragically, horrendously, was in a German concentration camp. You made a visit back there with your mother and aunt and with your brother. Tell me about it.
So it was always the untold story of our family was what happened to my grandfather, who was David, my mum's father. And out of the blue, 9 months ago, I get an email from Germany, a German historical group in a small town near Stuttgart, saying, we want to just confirm that you are the grandson of David Kozak. We have reason to believe that we have found the final documentation of his transfer from Auschwitz, with his Auschwitz number in November 1944, to this concentration camp outside Stuttgart, and where he died in January 1945. And so the four of us went back, my mother, my aunt, my brother and myself, and for the first time there was closure. Obviously it was very present for my mother. She was 5 years old when she last saw him. And so there was an enormous depth of family emotion, but there was also this extraordinary situation where we were there with 25 or 30 Germans of all generations who had this powerful sense that truth is the great liberator, and they had been determined to find the truth. And they were inspired in this when 15 years ago the local council had presented a story that whitewashed the history, and these German local volunteers were determined to find out about the 600 people who died there, about the mass grave for 75 where my grandfather was. So it was moving in a deep way on both a personal level, but also this German society that's rebuilt itself over the last 60 years.
Did it put some of the tribulations between you and Ed into perspective?
Well, obviously, you can't help but tread on the soil of Central Europe without having a totally renewed sense of some of the small struggles that can exist in the modern age, but also some of the lessons that continue to ring true. And the topics that we've talked about today tragically speak to some having to refight some of those battles.
But it was a very personal moment too, to be there with your brother, I know that you and he are very careful about how the rupture between the two of you is spoken about in the media and in public. but actually I think it's quite a compelling image of the two of you going to that. Just give me an insight into how that relationship is and how that trip affected it.
Well, we are very careful about what we say, because the danger is that in public life everything becomes public, whereas actually you need to reserve the space for private relations. I think that we both saw the importance of this for our own family story, and especially for my mother's family story. I think that the depth of the suffering just became so clear in the horrific details that one learns of people in this camp who, whether they had a shoe decided whether or not they could walk to the 3 kilometres to the mine where they were forced to work, and that decided whether or not they lived or died. And then on a personal level, I think it's really that sense of having a clearer sight of one's own heritage, which hadn't existed before, and so some pieces of the jigsaw were filled in.
So how is it between the two now?
Well, we always say the same thing, sort of maybe boringly for you, that we're brothers for life. The less that we say beyond that, the better to preserve that private space that is important. You can always, even for me to say yes, which of course time is a great healer, and so
things have healed.
You answer one question and someone as brilliant as you then goes further and further. What we always say is that we're brothers for life. We always say that we want each other to succeed in what each of us are doing, and we're always proud of the fact that we've never said things publicly that then poison a relationship, and that's, I think, the key to anyone.
But you do know, and your brother has had to do this too, to a degree, not to the degree that you did, what it is like to have to start completely afresh, start all over. You moved your family, you've got to have the end of this career devoted to politics.
Mm-hmm.
The lesson for starting again, how would you describe it and how did you cope with it?
I think the lesson is that taking a punch doesn't need to be the end of the, getting knocked over isn't the end of the story. It's whether or not you pick yourself up and how you pick yourself up. And I think that I've always been quite a sort of logical, rational person. Maybe some people have thought I was too logical, rational, but
this was a moment for pure emotion, wasn't it? To lose and have to start over.
I don't want to sound. Of course, there's emotion, but I always say two things to people. One, you should never do something if you're so afraid that if it goes wrong, you're not going to be able to survive. And when you run for the leadership, you've got to know what you're going to do if you're going to win, but you've also got to know that it's not the end of the world, however distraught you are, if you don't. But the second thing, of course, but the second thing is you always have your own resource. And the greatest resource is not just in here, it's with your nearest and dearest. So my wife, my kids, you said rightly, I moved to New York, but I moved with them. And life's an adventure that, if you're as lucky as I am, you have an adventure with your wife and your kids. And that always gave me the perspective. And so, yes, I managed to lose 2 elections in 2010, not just one election. One election is bad enough. But I think you've got to have a sense of perspective about these things, because otherwise you end up feeling sorry for yourself, and there's absolutely no benefit in that.
And as part of this big adventure that you described as, would you love to find a way back into the mainstream political scene here?
I'd love to find ways to make a big difference to the trajectory of the things that I care about. And I feel at the moment...
And in British politics?
No, I don't know whether that will be possible. And it's very... our system means that it's very hard to do that return. And you've got to always focus on what you're going to do next. And when people say come back, it almost implies to this idea that things haven't changed here. It's a dynamic situation, not a static situation.
So do you fear they might not have you back?
Well, That's a question for Jeremy Corbyn rather than for me. But that's not what's in my mind. What's in my mind is I'm running a $730 million organisation. I've got 25,000 staff in 196 of the world's toughest field sites around the world. I feel I'm making a difference on the things that I really care about. And the question I ask myself, probably, probably drive my staff mad by saying, well, what have we done today? But what one's got to say is, where can you make the most difference? And that's what I feel I'm doing at the moment. Yes, it's a big new start. Yes, it involves having to pick yourself up and rethink some of the most basic assumptions, but there are always new challenges, and I've written this book because that was a new challenge. I've never done that before. So you just got to try and keep on looking forward to how do you make an impact, how do you make a difference, which is what I was brought up to think is really important.
David Miliband, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.